Hello everyone, this is Sultan Ahmed Shajol, and I'm here to present our work TraceSplitter, a new paradigm for downscaling traces. This work was done with Rubaba Hassan, our advisors Timothy Zhu and Bhuvan Urgaonkar at Penn State, and our collaborator Siddhartha Sen from Microsoft Research. Here, we show an example system that you might find in production. It is a typical three-tier setup where a large cluster of web servers queries data from the database and caching tier. Now, as researchers, we would love to run realistic experiments with production traffic. Developers would also benefit from testing their new features and code changes in the production traffic. To perform such experimentation, a common approach is to collect the traces from the production setup and replay the traces on the experimental setup. These traces contain valuable information such as incoming traffic pattern, arrival time, payload size, etc. from real users. This information is valuable to both researchers and developers as they capture the real-world phenomena. However, with this approach, there comes a problem, which is the experimental setups are generally much smaller than the production setups. So, directly running the traces on a smaller experimental setup is not possible because the load would be too high. Thus, an important pre-processing step for running the trace on an experimental setup is to downscale the trace. Downscaling refers to the process of taking a trace and lowering its load to run it in a smaller setup. It is also important for the downscaling process to preserve the important characteristics of the original trace as much as possible for realistic experimentation. But how do they do this? One prominent approach in downscaling is to stretch out the requests in longer time period to reduce the load in the system. For example, to halve the load of a 24-hour trace, the requests in the trace are spread across 48 hours by doubling the interval time between the requests. We call this approach time span scaling. One obvious downside of this approach is the distortion of the temporal pattern. This would lead to problems in some systems such as autoscaling systems, where the autoscaler would think it has more time to react to the load changes than the original trace would have allowed. This can lead to incorrect evolution of the efficacy and agility of the autoscaling system. Another subtle and possibly counterintuitive pitfall of this approach is that it might create longer-lasting temporary overloads than the original trace. This can translate into deceptive overload with correspondingly degraded performance. Another popular approach for downscaling is taking the average arrival rate in a fixed time interval and multiply that by scaling factor to get a desired arrival rate. Then, a new downscaled trace is generated via an arrival process that has the calculated arrival rate. We call this approach average rescaling. The efficacy of this approach is highly dependent on the choice of the appropriate time interval. Choosing too small an interval can result in exaggerating the burstiness in the arrival process, while choosing a too large an interval may suppress it. In this example, we demonstrate the effect of choosing too long a time interval in the downscaled trace. As you can see, the downscaled trace does not represent the original trace. Learning the correct time interval requires extensive study of the trace, which is not always possible since such a study would be orthogonal to the actual work. And that is why this approach can easily lead to erroneous results. In this slide, we use an alternative representation of the trace for demonstration purposes. Here, we show a trace that has different request types and request sizes. Each request is depicted with a horizontal line. We depict the different request types by using different colors and different request sizes by using different thickness of the line. The widely used approach for downscaling we are discussing here involves randomly picking requests to generate downscaled traces. We call this approach random sampling. One key downside of this approach is that it can easily exclude important requests. Furthermore, the probability of being excluded is higher for rarer requests. As a result, the resultant downscaled trace may not be representative of the original trace. On the other hand, this sampling approach can also overrepresent the rare requests. With traces where the rare requests have very different performance characteristics than the regular requests, such under or overrepresentation can lead to misleading results in experiments. Here we present results from our experiments. In the presented graph, the y-axis contains the percentage of rare requests in the trace. Along the x-axis, we present the different traces. We take a trace and using random sampling, create 10 different downscaled traces, which we label as rand1 through rand10. As you can see, the rare requests made up 0.25% of the original trace. And while Rand 1 and Rand 8 do a good job of preserving that percentage in the downscale trace, the others do not do so well. So how can we realistically downscale a trace that will not suffer from the discussed pitfalls? If we look closely to the production setup, we can see that each node in the web server tier is fronted by a load balancer. This means that each node in the web server tier gets a partial view of the whole trace. In a well-balanced system, it can easily be assumed that any two nodes would experience statistically similar traffic in terms of trace characteristics that affect latency. And this insight leads us to the key idea of TraceSplitter. The key idea of TraceSplitter is that we can use load balancing techniques to downscale traces. We suggest that we can have an entirely hypothetical construct to mimic the load balancer in the system, which would generate multiple downscale traces. We claim that one can take any subset of the traces and consider that a properly downscaled trace of the original trace. And this is how we design our TraceSplitter framework. Our designed framework of TraceSplitter utilizes this insight by using a simulated load balancer. This takes the original trace and a user-provided scaling factor as input and generates multiple downscale traces using load balancing techniques. Each of these downscale traces would represent the requests seen by a subset of web server nodes. One key benefit of our approach is that we do not lose information in the sense that any rare requests would show up in at least one of the downscale traces. Our new framework for downscaling gives us several downscaling approaches borrowed from the load balancing policies. For example, we can use random load balancing for randomly downscaling traces, which is equivalent to the existing random sampling approach. The round-robin load balancing policy would result in deterministic sampling for downscaling. In this approach, at each round, it distributes the requests among the downscale traces in a deterministic manner. Another load balancing technique, joint shortest queue, can be translated to randomized round-robin, where at each round, the requests are distributed in a random manner. This approach minimizes the skewed behavior in RR resulting from deterministic pattern. However, in the presence of job size variability, we discovered that least work left policy performs best. When splitting a trace into multiple downscale traces, this policy assigns the requests to the downscale trace with the least work so far in the trace. We denote this as TSLWL. So in practice, how should one use TraceSplitter? The traces are collected from large production setups. We take the trace and use TraceSplitter to generate appropriately downscaled traces. These downscaled traces can then be used in experiments running in the experimental setup. One can take any one of these downscaled traces and perform experiments with this as it would represent the original trace. If one wishes to have more requests in their experiments, they can easily choose any number of downscaled traces for their experiments, used one after another. And if they do not want to miss out on any of the requests, they can also choose to run all the downscaled traces, one after another. In this case, they are making up for their smaller setup size with longer running experiments. To evaluate TraceSplitter, we look at latency-based performance metrics. In our evaluation, we first run the original trace in our original setup and record the latency numbers. After that, we run the downscale trace in the downscale setup and record the latency. Finally, we compare the latency-based performance between the original and the downscaled experiments. In practice, we do not expect or require the researchers to have access to the original setup. We only use this access to develop and evaluate TraceSplitter. For our experiments, we use multiple synthetic and real-world traces, one of which is the Microsoft OneRF trace. OneRF is a common web rendering framework that services web requests to Microsoft's storefront properties such as Xbox.com, etc. The trace used in our experiments tracks the high-level web requests from users that arrive at OneRF. We compared the latency-based performance of the original trace with traces generated using multiple downscaling approaches. Here we have a bar chart of different percentiles of latency where the x-axis has the percentiles and y-axis has the value. In this graph, the closer the latency of a downscale trace to the original, the better it is in preserving the characteristics of the original trace. As you can see from the plot, TSLWL matches the performance of the original trace very closely, even in the tail. TSRRR and RR do not do as well compared to the TSLWL due to not considering the job size information. The poor result of average rate scaling comes from failing to capture the short-term bursts due to poor choice of time interval. The performance of random sampling is also bad for not considering any of the properties while downscaling. Finally, the degraded performance of time-span scaling, or T-span, comes from the downscaled system being overloaded for a longer period than the original, something we touched upon earlier. This, and through several other experiments, we discovered that TSLWL performs the best in downscaling. That is why we promote this to be the superior approach. Please refer to the paper for details on all the experiments. To conclude, the target of this work is to show the downsides of popular downscaling techniques being used and to provide a novel solution that outperforms those. The key idea of our approach is that we propose using load balancing techniques to downscale traces while preserving trace characteristics. Our extensive experiments with both real-world and synthetic traces show the superiority of our approach. The source code of TraceSplitter has been open source for the benefit of the community. Thank you.